All right. Good morning and welcome everybody to Reading Royally. My name is Jane Stimpson. I am a librarian here at Lone Star Sci-Fair. And this live presentation is going to be all about books, both fiction and nonfiction, that have to do with royals. So if you are poised to take notes, don't worry, you don't have to. I actually have a reading list of every single book and author I'm going to mention as part of this presentation. It's available online as a PDF in that link that's up on screen, cyflib.info/royal reading. I'll also display this link at the end of the presentation, and I will send it to Claire as well to send out, so you'll have access to that. So just so you know, you do have the reading list. You can pull it up now, maybe start to mark some of the ones that you're most interested in as we talk today. Reading list is going to include the titles, the authors. It's going to let you know if it's fiction or nonfiction, and it's going to also have a link to the HCPL catalog record for that book. So again, I'm one of the librarians here. I have always been interested in reading about royals. Probably due mostly to my mother. So my dad is British, my mom is American, but my mom has always been a voracious reader. She says one of the things she's most proud about is having raised a librarian. And so she definitely passed on that love of reading to me, and especially reading about history and reading historical fiction. So you can see on screen a text exchange that we had as I was prepping for this preparation. I had asked her for recommendations, and she just, started to reel off just a ton right away. So she was a great fount of inspiration and recommendations. You can see in the text I had said, hey, what was that one book you said you liked? And was it this? She said, yes. And she said, wait, hang on, I'm going to tell you a different one. And I said, wait, was it this? She said, yes. So we had that nice little jinx mother-daughter mind meld moment there. I also want to give a big thanks to my colleagues because they also contributed reading recommendations for this. So especially Rachel and Tono, who are watching this morning, thank you for your recommendations, and thank you to anybody else on library staff I missed. Okay. So a few caveats before we really dive into this. I think most of you are probably going to know a lot of the books on this list, but that said, I probably missed your favorite. This is such a huge genre. It's so popular. We're going to cover a lot of ground really quickly. So I probably missed your favorite author. I probably missed your favorite title, although hopefully you will learn about some new ones. But if I did miss your favorite and you want to share it, you can actually use the chat feature. And if you want to type out your favorites in the chat box, we can collect those all at the end of the presentation and add them too. So there are many ways I could have organized this presentation, by country or by time period. Honestly, I could have done an entire hour just on Tudor fiction and nonfiction easily, by fiction, by nonfiction. So the way I've organized it, we're going to go loosely chronologically and loosely geographically. Sometimes I'm going to group some countries by dynasty. I am saving England for last because England is the bulk of this presentation. So big caveat here, this is definitely skewed towards the West, and it's skewed towards the Norman conquest onward. So if you were looking for things before 1066 or about Eastern royalty, I don't have a lot about that, I'm sorry. I also was trying to limit mostly to books that I have read or have had personally recommended to me, or books that are in our catalog. I tried really, really hard. There's only a couple that we don't have in the catalog, so I apologize in advance for those. Okay, let's get into it. So first up, we have some books from the ancient world, specifically dealing with Egypt, Rome, and Greece. So the first thing I want to let you know about are some books about Cleopatra. The first one is by Stacy Schiff. It's nonfiction. She writes fantastic histories. You might be familiar with her work. She wrote The Witches, about the Salem witch trials. And this was a fantastic book because for a very popular, well-known figure like Cleopatra, there's really not a lot on the historical record about her, and what there is really skewed. So Schiff is really great at separating fact from fiction, and the result is this history that's very readable and it's very engrossing. And we have this in multiple formats in the catalog, so ebook and e-audiobook as well. If you want a little bit more on Cleopatra and her romantic relationships, there's Cleopatra and Antony by Diana Preston. This is going to look specifically at her relationship with Antony and how that may have led to their downfall when Octavian sort of vanquished them, and sort of looks at sort of, what if they had prevailed, what would the world have been like? So very interesting. And for a fiction take on this, I'm going to be recommending Margaret George more than once throughout this presentation. She's one of those big names. She's known as the queen of fictional autobiography. And so Memoirs of Cleopatra is told point of view of Cleopatra. It is heavily based on research, though, so Margaret George definitely does her research and brings in all those historical details, so it's very engrossing. They later made this one into a TV miniseries. I'm really sorry, but for some reason this one is only available in Spanish in the catalog. I'm not sure why, so this might be one that you might want to try and find used or half-price books or something. Okay, continuing on to ancient Rome and Greece, and continuing on with Margaret George. These two books, Confessions of Young Nero and Splendor Before the Dark, are told from the perspective of Nero, Emperor Nero, who succeeded as emperor at age 16. I have not personally read these, but these have been personally recommended to me by my mom and also other library patrons who've read and have loved these two. So Margaret George, more rulers. For more on Rome, I recommend the Stephen Saylor's books. He writes fiction, and Claire, this is our first mystery series to talk about. It's the Roma Sub Rosa mystery series. Roman Blood is the first book in this series, but you don't really need to read this series in order. The main character is called Jordanus the Finder, and he sort of is like a police, sort of like a detective, sort of like a spy. There's not a lot that's technically royalty in here, but it does bring in historical figures like Cicero and Marcus Crassus. And then two on the Roman Empire. He has actually a lot of titles on the Roman Empire. So on our reading list, I'm just linking to all books by Saylor. And he has a couple, one called Rome, one called Empire, that tell the story of and imperial Rome respectively through the saga of one family. So if you really like multi-generation family sagas, Roma and Empire are for you. This family serves the empire, so we have some of that. And then finally on to Greece, again, not technically about royalty, but both of Madeline Miller's books are about gods and heroes, and kings do crop in occasionally, so I thought it was good to include these. Song of Achilles and Circe. The first one covers Achilles and the Trojan War. The second is from the point of view of the goddess Circe and her relationship with Odysseus. Miller's prose is so beautiful. It's so compelling. You're not going to want to put these books down. You really feel like these gods and demigods are living, breathing people. And these are available in multiple formats in our catalog. So definitely recommend those. Okay, moving on to our next location. I have to admit, when I made this title card for the Americas, I was very optimistic that I would have more books in this section. So I apologize, I only have a couple of titles in this section, and they're both about the Aztecs. The first one was recommended to me by my husband, actually, who is of Aztec descent. It's called Aztec. It was written by Gary Jennings. It was written in the 1980. It's a bestseller. It is fairly grisly. It's about it talks about some of the the human sacrifices that the Aztecs made and things like that. But it's the story of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, and it touches on Aztec rulers like Montezuma. So wanted to bring that in. And while researching this one, I came across a mystery series. Yes, that one is fiction, Claire. Thank you. Yes, I have notes on what these are. Yes, these ones are both fiction. And while researching this, I came across this 4-book mystery series called The Aztec Mysteries by Simon Levac. The first one is there on screen. It won the Crime Writers Association's debut Dagger Award. And unfortunately, again, this is one that we don't have in the catalog. It's just in Spanish. So this is one to track down online. But these mysteries are set 2 years before Cortez's arrival, and one of the main characters is Emperor Montezuma. And it's a mystery where a human sacrifice goes wrong, and somebody has to investigate what happened in that. So those are our Aztec mysteries. Apologize for the small section on the Americas. If you have books that you know of that would fit in that section, please share them in the chat. Okay, so with that small detour into ancient and pre-conquest lands, we're going to head to the continent. We are going to start in the east with Russia. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is Robert K. Massey's books. I could not recommend Massey's books more. He writes nonfiction. He's a Russian historian. So the first one I read of his was Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman. Some people have only heard of Catherine the Great because of unsavory, very untrue rumors about her death involving a horse. Totally not true. Instead, Massey gives us this amazing portrait of a woman who is very smart, very savvy, very determined. She started life as a minor German princess, and she ended up ruling as the Empress of Russia for 35 years. He drew on her memoirs and her letters extensively for this biography. And so we learn about her affairs. We learn about her ideas that she brought from Enlightenment Europe to Russia. So I always thought it was really interesting. She was one of the first people in Russia to get the smallpox vaccine, and she did it specifically. She had herself and her family vaccinated to prove to the rest of Russia that this Western science, this is safe, this is okay. So she's really credited with opening up Russia to European ideas quite a bit. Hulu has a new series called The Great that is based on Catherine the Great. It is very loosely based, but I've seen the first episode and it's pretty great. Now, Massey died last year, but he wrote several amazing books about Russian history. So I have Peter the Great here at home. He also wrote about Nicholas and Alexandra and the Romanovs as well. For a fictional take on Catherine the Great, there's The Winter Palace by Ava Stachniak. This was a recommendation from one of my colleagues. I have not read it, but it is definitely on my to-be-read list now. It looks at the rise of Catherine through her trusted servant and spy, Barbara. It's available in a few different formats, and there's also a sequel to this one called Empress of the Night. It just doesn't get as enthusiastic reviews. For more on the Romanov sisters, you can check out The Romanov Sisters by Helen Rappaport. This is nonfiction. This was one that was recommended to me by my mom. And it's a nonfiction look at the 4 Romanov sisters using their diaries, using their letters. A fictional narrative of this, again, recommended by my mom, is I Was Anastasia. This is a recent book in the Princess Anastasia Survives narrative. Now, of course, we know that's not true. We know from DNA testing at the remains that she did not survive that assassination. But this looks at the dual narratives of Princess Anastasia in her sort of last months and a woman named Anna Anderson, who many are convinced is the escaped princess. This one is also described for... Oh, thank you, Tona, for recommending that. This one was also described as suitable for young readers. So if you have any young readers in your life, I Was Anastasia could be good for them. I also want to talk just kind of generally about a book on Russian history. Tsars is one that's just a really good overview to Russian history. It's a nonfiction overview to all the dynasties ruling Russia. A fantastic book, also nonfiction, is The Amber Room, The Fate of the World's Lost Great Treasure. So the Amber Room was a gift of the Prussians to Peter the Great, and it was finally finished and installed in under Catherine the Great in one of her palaces. And it was basically a room of these beautiful, intricately carved amber panels. And when the Nazis invaded during World War II, they stormed the Catherine Palace and the panels went missing. So this book is written by two British journalists as they trace the history of the room, and then they try and trace what happened to it after the Nazis looted it, because it's basically disappeared. So it starts out with Russian history, and then it gets into like Cold War and spy stuff. So good if you like that. And finally, I would be remiss, I also wanted to mention this film called Russian Ark. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of it, but its claim to fame is that it is set in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and it was filmed in a single day in a continuous 90-minute take and shot. Okay, so the camera never cut. They basically had to get every single shot right. They had to start over. And in fact, they did have to start over 3 times. They finally got it on the 4th try. There's over 2,000 actors. There's over 3 orchestras, and it takes you through 30 rooms in the Winter Palace and through like 300 years of Russian history. So you can try and find this on Amazon Prime. There's also a copy on YouTube that you can try and look up. There's also a documentary on that film. So if you're interested in Russian history and the Winter Palace, Russian Ark, amazing film. Okay, heading westward. I had hoped to have more titles for each of these, so this is kind of a little odd grouping, but that's all right. Moving on to Italy. Although this first title doesn't seem like it fits, the first title I wanted to let you know about was Catherine de' Medici, Renaissance Queen of France. And you might think, why is this in the Italy section? Of course, Catherine de' Medici was originally from Italy and moved to France as a 14-year-old to marry the prince. This one and the next, Leone Frida, were both recommended by my mother. Sort of really interesting portraits of these noble women during the Renaissance. The second one there, Deadly Sisterhood, looks at 8 different Italian noblewomen during the Renaissance, and probably the most well-known that she covers there is Lucretia Borgia in that one. So those are a pair of great novels from a great writer. And then this next one, The Girl Who Would Be Queen, was also a recommendation from a colleague. I think, Tona, you might have recommended this one. Sorry if I'm mistaken about this one. But this is also on my to-be-read list now. This is set in 14th century Naples, and it centers around Joanna and Maria, who were 16 and 13, respectively, when they inherited the crown. This just came out last year, and there's already a sequel to this one called The Girl Who. And so those are a few Italian royalty ones to take a look at. Moving on to Spain, I really wish I had more in this section. I think this is another recommendation from our wonderful librarian Tona, called Sister Queens, The Noble Tragic Lives of Catherine of Aragon and Juana, Queen of Castile. We know Catherine of Aragon. Oh, Rachel Hugenberg, that was your suggestion. Thank you for that. So we know Catherine is the first wife of Henry VIII. I always knew Juana in history as Juana la Loca, or Juana the Crazy, which turns out to be not true, right? The history, again, was she was probably manipulated by the powerful male figures in her life, and that is probably not even true that she was crazy, like they say. So tragic is definitely the word for the fates of these 2 sisters. So this is, I think, the only joint biography of these two sisters. And this one is available as an ebook. The next one is from the Czech Republic. This was another recommendation from my mom. This is set in Prague in 1599, and it takes place in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Claire, this is a mystery. This is available in print and in large print in our collection. And Benjamin Black is the pseudonym of a writer named John Banville, who's won the Man Booker Prize. So really great, tense, and sort of atmospheric mystery in this one. Okay. All right. On to France. This is our last stop on the continent before we head to England over the English Channel. Okay, so let's start with some of the classics here. So Barbara Tuchman, A Distant Mirror, total classic. Barbara Tuchman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and A Distant Mirror follows a French nobleman named de Courcy. He marries into English royalty. It deals with wars, the plague, crusades, more plague, just a lot of plague and a lot of wars in this one, but really fascinating look at the 14th century, and that one is available in e-audio, and the reviews of the e-audio are really fantastic. Apparently the narrator of that does a great job with the English and French accents. I also want to mention this series that was recommended by a colleague. Not sure if this was Tona or Rachel. Apologies. This is the Accursed Kings series. It was published in the mid-1950s to early 1960s. This is a 7-book series. The first one is called The Iron King, and it was Tona. Great. Tona recommended this one. Thanks, Tona. It's set in 1314. It deals with the French king Philip the Fair and Lord Robert of Artois, who has to fight for his birthright in this saga about the 100 Years' War. This series was apparently very popular with people who finished the Game of Thrones series and were left bereft and needing another series. So if you've read Game of Thrones and you really want another series like this, I would give this one a try. And many of these are available as ebooks in our catalog. Okay. Moving on to Nancy Goldstone. She writes French and English history about royals, and Four Queens was originally a recommendation from my mother, and then I read it and loved it. And it traces the lives of 4 daughters of the Count of Provence. They all became queens of France, England, Germany, and Sicily in the 13th century. Goldstone and her husband usually write together their collector of rare books and manuscripts. So she is great at using primary source documents and accounts to put together these histories. And this one is available as an ebook and as an e-audio book as well. And then finally, one last one from Leonie Frida is Francis I, the maker of modern France. Leonie wrote the books on Catherine de' Medici we saw earlier. Francis was king of France in the mid-1500s, so we'll hear about his relationship with other royals like Henry VIII and Charles V. He was a very flawed ruler, and this is sort of her attempt to give a more balanced portrait of him throughout history. Okay, we're doing good on timing. I was hoping that we would get to England by the halfway mark, and this is our last bit before England, so we're doing good on time. Sorry if I'm rushing a little bit. I had to take a section to talk about books about Marie Antoinette because there are just so many fantastic ones. She's probably the most famous French queen, of course, and the last one. So probably the best seminal work out there is Antonia Fraser's work. We're going to hear a lot more about her. Marie Antoinette, The Journey. This was, if anybody saw the Sofia Coppola movie starring Kirsten Dunst, this is the book that movie was based on. It is nuanced, it is fair. Lady Fraser does an amazing job bringing in and balancing and analyzing sources, which is one of the reasons I love her writing. And we get a very balanced portrait of Marie Antoinette. You really do feel sympathy for her in a way. So really interesting, fascinating glimpse into her life. Similarly, another recommendation from Mom is Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution. And this is a biography, again, of Marie Antoinette, but it looks at her through the perspective of the fashions that she helped popularize. So we're used to seeing her in the image that you can see on screen, right, with the huge gowns and the huge wigs, but she wasn't all that, right? She rejected corsets. She really loved to dress up as like a fake shepherdess and go play in her like fake little shepherd village called the Petit Trianon at Versailles. So the author is really making the case here that she wasn't just frivolous about fashion. She really used her fashion, and she was a huge influencer throughout the country and throughout the continent. But she really used her fashion as a way to assert herself politically. So this is, again, fascinating glimpse into Marie Antoinette and specifically the fashion of the day. And then finally, book I wanted to talk about is another nonfiction book by Will Bashore called Marie Antoinette's Darkest Days. And this one is looking specifically at the last 2.5 months of Marie Antoinette's life. So after she is separated from her family in the temple where they had been kept prisoner, and it's where she's imprisoned in the conciergerie. And she was known as Widow Capet, or prisoner number 280 there. And the conciergerie was a notorious prison. It was dank, it was fetid, it was known as the waiting room to the guillotine. Prisoners basically only spent like a day or two there before being taken right out to the guillotine. But Marie Antoinette spent 2.5 months there before she was brought to trial and convicted. I actually toured this building when I visited Paris, and Bashore does a great job. He includes a floor plan, so he really brings that prison to life and her last days to life. And it's a very, again, sympathetic portrait of Marie Antoinette. Now, this one is only available as an ebook, but it is there in overdrive for you. So that's Marie Antoinette. All right. We made it to England. So lots to talk about here in England. We're going to move from pre-conquest to the present. But first I wanted to talk about some of the big ones. Y'all, there are so many. Again, I could have done the whole hour just on this. You can see some of the big authors on screen. I'm sure you can all add more to this. I'll be talking about only a few of these. Excuse me. But I did quickly want to talk about a few overviews. So the first one is Royal Panoply. This is Brief Lives of the English Monarchs. And when they say brief, it really is. It's maybe 8 to 10 pages on each monarch. This is a really great one if you're like me and you watch something, a historical drama on TV about a royal figure, and you're like, oh, but what's the real story? This is great to just dip into and get the quick story about that ruler. A similar one is called Game of Queens by Sarah Gristwood. This is a really fast-paced coverage of Renaissance queens, so it's really just looking at the 16th century mostly. It goes from Isabella of Castile to Elizabeth I, and this is available as an ebook with no holds on it right now, or as of last night, it had no holds on it, so you could check that out right now if you wanted to. And then finally, as far as overviews, I wanted to tell you about Ian Mortimer's Time Traveler's Guides. He has 3 of them: Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, Elizabethan England, and Restoration England. These are styled like travel guides. So if you were just plonked in the middle of that time period, what would you have to know to be able to fit in society there? So it's not strictly about royalty, but I think it's a really nice complement to all of these books because it's going to be talking daily life and social customs, which would of course have been influenced by the royalty in the courts of the day. These are available as e-audiobooks as well, and just fantastic. Highly recommend those. Okay, so let's talk about some of our big ones here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Lady Antonia Fraser. I have a couple of her books well worn at home. She is one of the foremost writers on British history. She's 87. She is still writing. You cannot go wrong with anything that she has written. She writes about English and French history. She does extensive research. She weaves it in so deftly. And again, she talks about she puts the sources in context, which I really love in my nonfiction history. I want to know were sources manipulated? Are they biased? How did the historian make the decision on which ones to include? So I love that behind the scenes glance. She's great at that. Ones that I personally have read and recommend are the Marie Antoinette one, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, The Gunpowder Plot, all fantastic. She also writes historical fiction, and she has a series of mysteries called the Jemima Shore novels. The first one is called Quiet as a Nun, if you're interested in her fiction. Okay, the next big one I wanted to talk about is Alison Weir, one of my favorites. She writes nonfiction and fiction. I'm sure you've heard of her. She is very prolific. I'm going to share a very unpopular opinion right now, probably. I love Alison Weir's nonfiction. Amazing. She's just like Antonia Fraser. She does great historical research. She weighs the sources. She tells you about them. Fantastic. My unpopular opinion is that I hate her fiction. I'm really sorry to anybody that loves her fiction, but I read her, I know, I'm sorry. I read her nonfiction, The Life of Elizabeth I, amazing. And then I thought, okay, I'll read her fiction, The Lady Elizabeth. Y'all, no. She starts talking about, in the fiction book, one of the plot lines is Elizabeth gets deflowered and impregnated by Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr's husband, after Henry VIII. Y'all, there is no evidence that that happened. It drives me nuts when they take liberties like that, so I cannot condone Alison Weir's fiction. If you like them, more power to you. I just can't with Alison Weir. I feel the same way about Philippa Gregory. So I'm sorry, but I can't recommend Philippa Gregory fiction. But I know she's very, very popular. But her nonfiction, incredible. She has a series called England's Medieval Queens. I have Queens of the Conquest here at home, and she has Queens of the Crusades forthcoming in November. Highly recommend The Life of Elizabeth I. She also has nonfiction on Mary Queen of Scots, The Princes in the Tower, Eleanor of Aquitaine, basically everybody, right? But the one I would really, really love to recommend to you is The Lady in the Tower, The Fall of Anne Boleyn. This is specifically looking at the last 100 days of Anne Boleyn's life after she is imprisoned in the Tower. And she makes a really compelling case that Anne Boleyn was probably innocent of adultery. Yeah, she meddled where she shouldn't have, especially when it came to religion and Henry VIII's counselors, but she probably didn't commit adultery. So this was a really compelling look at and why she may have acted she did in the last sort of months of her life. All right, and then another big one, I'm sure you all have heard of the Hilary Mantel Wolf Hall series. It's a blockbuster, right? It's a trilogy. The third one, The Mirror and the Light, just came out a few months ago. I was really lucky that our library director, Susan, managed to get it just before the libraries closed, and I managed to borrow it from her. So I'm sorry if you have it on hold and you're waiting. But this is a trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, secretary and right-hand man to Henry VIII through the 1530s. And they are written in a stream of consciousness style, so it's not an easy book to just kind of like pick up and dip in and out of. But once you kind of get sucked in, it's amazing. Her prose is so brilliant. You really get into his head. So I just cannot say enough about this series. So if you haven't started it yet, start with Wolf Hall, and then hopefully by the time you get to The Mirror and the Light, it'll be ready for you at the library. Now this was also adapted into a mini series with starring Mark Rylance, a PBS masterpiece series that was amazing. They filmed it all with natural light, so it's very dark and atmospheric, incredible. It also stars Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn. And this was also adapted into stage plays that I was lucky to see both numbers 1 and 2 at Main Street Theater in Houston. So I'm anxiously awaiting the adaptation of the last one. Okay, some more classics. So we're sort of moving chronologically through English history now. Some more classics for you, The Once and Future King and The Winter King. Fiction about King Arthur by some heavy hitters, T.H. White, Bernard Cornwell. If you haven't heard about Hild, this was written by Nicola Griffith. It's very loosely based around the future Saint Hilda of Whitby. It's based in the 7th century, and it covers Hilda as a child. She grew up pagan and then is baptized or converted to Christianity, along with her uncle, the Anglo-Saxon King Edwin. I really loved this one because it's a time period you don't often see in historical fiction, and it also deals with the daily lives of women in a way a lot of books don't. I need to reread this one, I realized as I was doing this presentation. So Hild is available as a book and an ebook. I think you're going to like it. Okay, we're skipping over some of the Norman conquest. We're heading to the Plantagenets. Of course, the classics are the plays The Lion in Winter, about Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. I was very lucky in high school. I saw that on Broadway with Stockard Channing and Lawrence Fishburne. Amazing. It is, we have it on DVD and also as an audio adaptation in our catalog. Another classic is The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay. It was written in the 1950s, and it's about a detective who has had an accident. So in his free time while he's recuperating, he decides to investigate the disappearance of the princes in the tower as if it were a crime. And this one comes down on the side of Richard III being innocent of his nephew's disappearance. So if you are on sympathetic and on the side of Richard III in history, I kind of am, you're going to really love Daughter of Time. Similarly, I think you will like the nonfiction, The King's, about in the last 5-10 years or so, they discovered the burial place of Richard III. He had been pretty unceremoniously dumped in a pit after the Battle of Bosworth, and eventually his remains were found under a church car park. And so this is about the search for the bones, about identifying the bones. And this is written by Philippa Langley. She's the head of the Richard III Society and the person who led this sort of discovery and search. So really fascinating. Other fiction writers about the Plantagenets you might want to check out are Sharon K. Penman and Philippa Gregory. They both have various books in ebooks in our catalog. A couple of nonfictions about this time period come from Dan Jones. Those two books complement each other, especially if you're interested in the Wars of the Roses and that transition between Plantagenets and Tutors. And then finally, the last couple don't really fit, but they're some of my absolute favorite series, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about them. So Alice Clare has a few different mystery series. The Alf Fenn series is set just after the Norman conquest, and William II is a character in a couple of the books. And the Hockenly Abbey or Hockenly Mystery series, the main character is an abbess and she solves mysteries. It's set in 1100, and Eleanor of Aquitaine and King John make an appearance in those. So those are some of my absolute favorite series of all time. Okay, on to the Tutors. Again, could have done the whole hour just on the Tutors. I want to tell you about a few mystery series. The first one is S.J. Paris. She writes a series of mysteries. The main character is Giordano Bruno, who was a real-life person. He was a philosopher, and in her books, he is a detective and a spy working for Elizabeth I. So in addition to Elizabeth, some of the real-life characters we see in these mysteries are John Dee, Francis Drake, Francis Walsingham, Mary Queen of Scots. The first book is called Heresy, and there are 6 books total. The last one just came out this month. Moving on, okay, so I have to admit, I get these two series mixed up all the time. So because the authors' names are very similar, right? S.J. Paris, C.J. Sansom, and they're set during the same time period, and the titles are even similar. So the C.J. Sansom series stars Matthew Shardlake, and he is a hunchback detective. So it's a really interesting character perspective, and he works for Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII, and later for Elizabeth I. This is a mystery series. There's 7 books in the series. The latest one came out this year. The first one is called Dissolution, and it starts. It's based on the dissolution of the monarchy, the monasteries that Henry VIII and Cromwell perpetrated during the Reformation. If I had to pick between those 2 series, I think I give the Matthew Shardlake series the edge. I think that's probably my preferred one. And the last series I want to tell you about, but only briefly because it's not in the catalog for some reason, is the James Forrester Clarenceau trilogy. It stars a main character named William Hawley, or Clarenceau, and he is a herald. So he does all the sort of timelines of the royalty and the nobility in England. He's also Catholic, which is a really interesting perspective to have in 1560s England, right, during the Reformation. So that's a really interesting perspective. The first one is Sacred Treason. The author is James Forrester, and James Forrester is actually the pen name of Ian Mortimer, who wrote the Time Traveler's Guide's nonfiction series. So there you go. A couple standalones, The Butcher's Daughter by Victoria Glendinning. It stars a character named Agnes Pepin, not royalty, but like the first one in the Shardlake series, it deals with the dissolution of the monasteries. So she is literate. She works for an abbess in the Shaftesbury Abbey, one of the biggest ones, and so it's about the effects of the dissolution of the monasteries on the monks and the nuns who were suddenly turned out and had to make their way in the world. It's a fantastic perspective. I loved that book very much. Agnes Pepin is a memorable character. And then finally, she's back, the queen of fictional autobiography, Margaret George. She is the autobiography of Henry VIII. The conceit is that he wrote his memoirs and they were found 10 years later by his fool, who is now annotating them. And the Elizabeth I one starts in 1588, so in the later years of her reign, and it's kind of a dual narrative between Elizabeth and her cousin Lettice Knollys, who is married to Elizabeth's favorite, Robert Dudley. So again, fantastic sort of fictional autobiography of these 2 characters. She also has a book on Mary, Queen of Scots as well. All right, a couple standalone Tudor nonfictions. Her Majesty's Spy Master is all about Francis Walsingham, who really practiced spycraft in a modern way. So this kind of traces things that he developed, like code breaking and double agents, right? Continued into the modern era. Here's another one from Leanda de Lisle, The Sisters Who Would Be Queen. Leanda de Lisle is another prominent writer of this period. She also has a book called Tudor about this entire period. The Sisters Who Would Be Queen focus on the Grey sisters. We're most familiar with Jane Grey, or the 9 sisters who were also imprisoned and also had pretty tragic lives. So this is a really interesting way of piecing together the fact and the fiction on these sort of overlooked sisters. And then speaking of overlooked characters, one last the one Spanish sisters, Catherine and Juana. Jane Boleyn is a really interesting character. She was married to Anne Boleyn's brother George. Her testimony played a huge part in the conviction and beheading of Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. And Jane Boleyn was later caught up in the Catherine Howard scandal. This is sort of really interesting glimpse into what we do know about her, and this one is available as e-audio. Oh my gosh. So many. I told you those tutors were going to be long. Okay, a few to talk about with the Stewards. The King's Witch is fiction by Tracy Borman. She writes a lot of fiction in this time period. James I was obsessed with rooting out witchcraft, so this is fiction from the point of view of a healer who is accused of witchcraft. It also deals with the gunpowder plot. Really loved this one. There's also a sequel to this that's now on my to-be-read list. Daughters of the Winter is a nonfiction look at James I's daughter, Elizabeth, and her four daughters, and sort of how they went on to get married into and sort of rule various places. And this one is available as an Queen's book, and she relies a lot on those rare books, so you know this one is going to bring a lot of history into it. Okay. So Charles I was the monarch who was executed by Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads. So we have a couple books about that execution. Charles Spencer, brother to Lady, he sort of traces the history of the regicide and what happened after and how they were sort of tracked down by the crown once the restoration happened. And The Wolves of Andover is sort of like fiction to that. Kathleen Kent wrote The Heretic's Daughter about being accused in the Salem witch trials. The Wolves of Andover is a sequel to that, and the main character is one of the regicides, and about how he's being tracked down even after he's moved. Fantastic. Several books about Queen Anne, who was the last Stuart monarch, some nonfiction, some fiction. Some of these deal with Sarah Churchill, who was Queen Anne's favorite and probably her lover. So some really interesting fiction takes on that, including the film The Favorite, which came out, I think, last year, starred Olivia Colman. Amazing if you have not gotten a chance to look at that yet. I only have a few in the Victoria era. I have to admit, I'm very much more a Tudor time period person. So these were all recommendations from, they're all nonfictions. Yay, are these Rachel's recommendations? I think this is maybe your time period. So these are all colleagues. I haven't read a lot of these, but these are all coming from different scopes and perspectives, right? So serving Victoria, what the household was like, and also what her relationship was like with Albert. So a few to check out there, highly recommended from librarians. Okay, last few slides, y'all. We're getting towards the end. This is my last slide on England. I wanted to talk about a few in the modern era. So George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm was another mom recommendation. This is a Publishers Weekly starred review, and it's a group biography of cousins who George was the emperor, excuse me, George was King of England. Wilhelm was emperor, the ruler of Germany, Kaiser, yes, Kaiser, and Nicholas II was Tsar of Russia. So it's about these three rulers, and this was a great quote from one of the reviews. So it talks about these, quote, anachronisms presiding over courts that were stagnant pawns of tradition and conservatism. And it calls these three, it says the three possessed average intelligence and little imagination. All were unprepared for their jobs and didn't improve with on-the-job training. So this is about sort of the storm of World War I to come, and about these leaders who, yeah, maybe were not up to the task. Moving into the modern era, His Majesty's Hope is the third book in the Maggie Hope series. This is a mystery series starring Maggie Hope, who was a spy during World War II, and also Winston Churchill's secretary. These are fiction. I really love this series. We see King George, Princess Elizabeth, Winston Churchill are all in these, and these are also available as ebook and e-audiobook. And probably for our most recent royal entries are a pair of books from Heather Cox and Jennifer Morgan. These are fiction. They write a very popular celebrity fashion blog, but they have branched out into young adult literature. The Royal We, as you can sort of tell by the cover, is a very fun take on the William and Kate story. The protagonist is an American student named Bex, and she meets on her study abroad year the British Prince Nicholas, and they fall in love. And so it's very much about sort of the paparazzi, and the prince has a wayward young if that sounds familiar. Um, the Heir Affair just came out like last month, I think, and it's sort of about the pressure for an heir. These are very funny. They're very fast paced. They're very well researched, and they're geared towards young adults, but anybody can read them. So if you have young adults in your life, they might really like these takes on royalty. Okay. Oh, sorry, last 3 slides. I forgot I threw this one in here. Um, this last list of books, I side for those who are closest to royalty. So all the books on screen are about royal lovers or mistresses or misters. The Kings, Elizabeth and Leicester is the one that I have read first on this list. Amazing. The King's Mistresses is definitely the most fun title on this whole list. This is definitely my to-be-read list. This is also where we get our only entry from Asia in Empress Dowager Sichi. And if you want just an overview about powerful sort of mistresses, Sex with Kings is going to be a good overview. So if you're interested not just in the royals, but in the people who loved the royals like Nell Gwyn and Madame de Pompadour, some of these titles might be for you. Okay. Okay, now we're on our last slide. So this is, I set aside a couple of not strictly true tales. I told you I really prefer historical fiction that is very true to the history and follows it, but these are a couple of exceptions that I loved and had to tell you about. So My Lady Jane was recommended to me by Melanie, one of our teen librarians, and just a treasure trove of knowledge about young adult literature. Really skeptical, especially when I heard that this was a paranormal retelling of the Jane Grey tale. But I had just read the second book in their series called My Plain Jane, which is a retelling of the Jane Eyre story. So I was like, all right, I'll read this. This is crazy, but I loved it. So it tells the story of Jane Grey, but in a world where the Catholic and Protestant conflict is recast as a conflict between people who can shapeshift and people who can't. So paranormal, definitely not true at all. So Jane Grey's husband, Guilford Dudley, in real life is Gifford. In this novel, he cannot control shapeshifting into a horse by day. It is bananas, but it is very witty. It is very well done. If you know the history of Jane Grey well, you're going to really love this take on it. And then finally, the last series that I had to tell you about is The Chronicle of St. Mary's. This was recommended to me by Pam, one of our librarians, who you all may know from all of her wonderful life presentation on cooking and baked goods throughout the years. The Chronicles of St. Mary's series, and there are 10 in the main series and about a half a dozen spin-off books. This is about an English organization called St. Mary's that researches historical events in contemporary time. Do not call it time travel, but it's time travel, right? And so the first book was self-published and it became a bestseller. So all of these are available in ebook on Kindle format. And these books are going to take you all around the timeline. So from the Cretaceous period to the future time police headquarters, but there's a ton of royalty that crop up along the way. William of Normandy, Henry the in the Tower, Owen Tudor, Mary Queen of Scots, Henry VIII, Jane Grey, Elizabeth I, really just about everybody. It's very witty, extremely witty. I laugh out loud all the time. It's very self-aware. It's just a series of great fun. I do recommend that you read them in order. It's one of those series where you do kind of need to read them in order. And the first one is up on screen, just one damned thing after another. You will love these if you love historical fiction. Woo! Okay, 10:55. I was trying to condense it as much as I could, y'all. I'm sorry that I only gave us 5 minutes at the end. I know that was a whirlwind. But our reading list is available online. You can go back in and take a look at everything that I mentioned throughout the presentation today. We do have just a few minutes, though, for questions or suggestions. So if you would like to yes, I will. Thank you. Tona just asked, could we have access to the PowerPoint? Absolutely. I will save that as a PDF and send that to Claire, and also make that available with a link. So we'll get that on, I don't know if we can add it to the LifeLib guide, but we'll certainly get it available online and sent out through everyone. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions or suggestions? Feel free to add them to the chat. I'd be happy to talk more about any more of these titles.
You really have a fascination for this stuff, don't you?
I really do. It is very much my niche, and like I said, the Tudor time period. If we ever want to do another hour just on the Tudors, I got you covered.
Well, tell us quickly about your heritage, and that you have a little shady past.
Sure. So thank you so much, Mariana. So yeah, so I was telling Claire before this began, one of my fascinations with this. So my dad is British, my mom is American, my mom is a voracious reader, and so I really got and this is one of her favorite time periods and things to read about. As you can tell, I got so many recommendations from her. But one of the real reasons I'm interested in this is because one of our family rumors is that we are illegitimate descendants of one of Victoria's sons, Prince Edward. My great-great-grandmother supposedly worked in the palace and was hastily married off to a guy named Stimpson, and they had a child, and that child was my great-grandfather, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the prince, is what they say. I don't know. There's also a rumor that great-grandfather could also be Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, who also hung around. So, rumors abound.
Oh, this is great. Oh, thank you, Jane. I'm just so excited to explore my last mystery book club. So I'm trying to find a really cool book. So I'll have to check these out.
Okay, yeah, lots of mysteries in this list for sure. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now. Thank you for coming, and hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thanks, Jane. I just want to quickly mention next week we're celebrating Independence Day, so no life program, but January 8th, Ireland with Jen. So we should
July 8th?
Wear green.
Okay, July 8th.
I believe that's right, July 8th.
Yes, sorry, you said January.
Oh, did I say January? Okay.
Far in the future.
Jays.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks again. And thanks everybody for coming.